In this episode, I'm going to show you the use of the quick selection tool to create a selection of the skater in this image. All right, so the selection tool is right over here, or the selection tools. We have the quick selection tool and the lasso tool. These are the main ones I'm going to be using. So the quick selection tool has some specific settings up here. You can add or create a new selection, add to a selection, and subtract from a selection. So I like just to start with add to a selection, and really all you have to do is just click and drag, but I do want to just point out one thing to you. You have an option to adjust the size of the brush that you're selecting, also the hardness. So the hardness will define the edge of the brush. Either at 100%, it'll be a very crisp edge. At 0%, it will be a very soft, kind of faded edge. All right, I'm going to keep that at 100 pixels, or the size is set to 14 pixels, and I don't really need to mess with any of the spacing or these other options here. So essentially what you do with the quick selection tool is click and drag over the area you want to select. And like the name implies, it's rather quick. However, it doesn't always do a great job. So if I want to, it kind of grabs some of the pixels down here that I don't want as my selection. So basically the quick selection tool is looking for contrast between pixels. And it does a pretty good job if you have a high contrast image. You know, where I have the arm right against the background. It did a pretty good job defining that, especially on the head here as well, where we have the dark hair contrasted with the light background. So the quick selection tool does do a pretty good job if you're, working with a high contrast image. But down here where I kind of have the browns of the skateboard and some muted kind of greens and reds in this area as well, it doesn't do such a great job. I'm going to subtract that area from the selection by simply just pressing the Alt button. And if you notice, it switches up here. So again, pressing the Alt button and releasing it will toggle back and forth between adding and subtracting your selection. I could come up here and just click on that button and then click and drag, but then I have to come back up here to switch back to the add to selection option. Whereas if I just use the Alt button, I can toggle between subtracting and adding to my selection. All right, now down in here, it doesn't want to really get me where I need to go with this. It's kind of grabbing some extra pixels there. So what I do recommend is kind of zooming in a little. And to be a little more precise, I'm going to switch to the lasso tool. And the lasso tool works similarly to the quick selection tool. By the options you have here, you can create a new selection, add to a selection, subtract from a selection, and intersect with a selection. So I'm just going to hold the Alt button to switch to from adding to subtracting. And I'm just going to come in here and start looping around the areas that I don't want as part of my selection. So with the lasso tool, you have to click and drag with your mouse and kind of loop around the pixels that you want to either subtract from the selection or add to the selection. So it does take a little bit of practice getting the hang of the lasso tool, but once you get it, it's a great way to be a little bit more precise than the quick selection tool can do. All right, looks pretty good. Maybe just a little bit off the knee. And I'm going to switch back to the quick selection tool, hold the Alt button, and just click and drag and subtract the area here from that. It took too much, obviously, so Control Z to back up. And then I'm just going to hold the Alt button. Just to kind of get a little bit more that area in there. Let's zoom in a little bit, and we'll switch to the lasso tool. I want to add to the selection. So when you're adding to a selection, you start inside the selection, you go beyond the edge of the selection to what you want to include in the selection, and you loop it back around. And then on the opposite of that, I'm holding the Alt button, I'm going to start outside of the selection and then go into the area I want to deselect. So start out here, holding the Alt button, getting a little closer to that pants leg, subtracting that from my selection. And you can zoom in and get as close as you want to this. You can select many different pixels, or individual pixels rather. Okay, let's see, we're missing part of his finger up here, so I'm going to use the lasso tool to get this area. Actually, let's see, right there. Let me zoom in a little bit more. And then get a little bit more of the knuckle. It's kind of got an interesting pose on that finger. So that's an important detail I want to include. And then maybe we'll take away a little bit of this little sliver right there. And that's looking pretty good. Maybe a little bit more the edge of the knuckle. And that looks pretty good. All right, the next thing to do is to click the Select and Mask option. And let's zoom out a little bit. You have some options how you want to view this. Basically, this is going to mask out everything but the part that I selected. And you have some ways to kind of refine that selection. Now, as far as view, this is new to Photoshop. It used to be just the marching ants option. Now you have several options here. Take a look, whatever one you prefer. Do that. It doesn't really matter a whole lot. It's just a matter of personal preference, but you can kind of see what this will eventually look like as when I mask this out. I notice there's a little spot right there that I want to go ahead and take out. So I'm going to hold the Alt button and then just loop around that and see if I can get rid of that little section right there. Just looking a little odd. Okay, looking pretty good. All right, so I'm going to just have it on black so you can kind of see some of the options down here. Smoothing, for the most part, you can do edge detection. You can click Smart Radius, and then that automatically Photoshop looks at the pixels next to your selection, and then includes any pixels that are similar in color. But for this selection, I don't want to do that. I don't want to use this. It's a little better if you have a selection where you try to capture a lot of fine detail like hair or fur. But I don't want the Smart Radius on for this particular portion. I do want to smooth it, however, and maybe go 15-20%. Feathering just kind of blurs the edge, and obviously you can overdo this, so play around with that. The idea with feathering, with a small selection like this, a very fine-tuned selection, just a few pixels, maybe a couple pixels, that's it. And what this does, it kind of blurs and softens the edge so that when you place this onto another selection or a background image, you get a little bit of mixing between the pixels of the object and the pixels in the background. Contrast, it kind of does the opposite of feathering. It makes the edge more kind of contrasted and more pixelated in a sense. So I don't want to do any contrast or raise the contrast on that. Shifting the edge, I'm not going to mess with that either. I don't really need to in this case. But in some cases, you might want to bring the edge in slightly. All right. Moving the cursor to the left will bring the edge inward. Moving the cursor to the right, or the slider to the right, extends the edge outward. And again, I don't really want to do that here. So I'm going to bring this back down to 0. Some selections this works fine, but for this, I really don't need to do it. And the last thing I want to do is go ahead and output this to a new layer with layer mask. And then lastly, click OK. So what essentially this does, it masks out all this background area, and it just leaves that selected portion. Next video, I'm going to show you how to move this and start arranging the image with the background.